Hello, I'm Dara Thomason of Stitch Quilting Co. And this week, for our Learn to Quilt charity quilt along, we are going to learn how to lay out our blocks, how to make sure that we like our layout. I'm going to show you my way of marking the blocks to know which way to for sewing, and then we're going to sew our rows together, and then we're going to sew our top together. And this quilt goes together so quickly. All right, so it might look like I have a little list. My list here is the way that I mark my layout. So if you look at the layout here in front of me, I basically followed the pattern design here. So we've got our 9 patch, of course, and then our solids. And so we have it all laid out. And so I have it in front of me, and I have it in this order. Now, because I decided to use 2 different fabrics in this for my 8-inch blocks, I just have them coordinated. So my teepees go on the 1st, 3rd, and 5th row, and my print design like this goes on the 2nd and 4th. Because you can do this in so many different ways, you can use up your scraps, you can do whatever works for you. I just decided that was going to work for me. And also, when I put my 9 patches together, I always have my teepees in the center, and then I have my graphic print in the middle this way. So that kind of looks nice how it all kind of works together. All right, so what I do with my list here is I write out the numbers on this. I just use an old cash register tape that no longer fit the register. And then what I do is, so I have 5 rows and 5 rows and 5 blocks per row. So in the center block, I'm going to rip off, if you want to use scissors you can, that each one. So I'm ripping and I'm just placing them on there. So now I know in what order. So I have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. And then after I do that, I take my beautiful pins here that I got from Clover, and then I will pin each one in the center. And the reason I do that is because I want to make sure that I'm not interfering with my seams when I'm going to sew my rows together. So that's important to me. Some of you might think this is a lot of work to do, but what I have found, having a busy family with children, and I don't always haven't had a dedicated space for quilting. And a lot of times, of course, when you're laying out a quilt, this one's a good size, and I have this nice table. But if you're laying out quite a big quilt, and you're trying to figure out where they go, you're generally using a floor. Sometimes you might have a ping pong table or a pool table or somewhere else. But generally speaking, you're laying it on the floor, and you can't keep it there. And maybe it's like way in the other part of your house or downstairs or whatever it is. And so you can't be going up and down making sure that it's going to stay in the same order. So I find that when I do it this way and then I've pinned them, then they are secure. So if by chance one of my kids find my nicely stacked pile of fabric and they knock it over by accident or something happens, you don't have to worry about it. It's there and you can put it back together. I'm not sure how many unfinished projects you have in your closet or bins or whatever, but I know for myself, I tend to have some unfinished projects. So if I've gone through all the trouble to lay out my quilt and then I put it away and I don't come back to it for 2 or 3 years, it's all ready to go. So you're just helping yourself out. I have tried in the past to use sticky notes. The adhesive doesn't really work, so it's not great. If you feel confident that you don't have to pin this down, and then if you use, for example, from Michael's, you can buy those scrapbooking paper sorters, and they have like a snap. You could do something like that if you feel really confident. You don't have to pin them, but I just like having that security of knowing that that's like that. So then you just go ahead and you just keep going on that one. When I'm doing rag quilts, for example, I actually sew through the paper. So if I'm making the crosses for the batting and I'm doing the 3 layers, I just sew this right in the paper. That saves me a step, and then you just tear it out. So that's another strategy. Now, when you're laying out, this one's a fairly simple layout design because I'm being very limited in the amount of colors that I have. But if you have gone, for example, my Lori Holt Autumn Love quilt that I did, they're all really scrappy. So if you're doing something like that and you want to have it kind of diverse, what I recommend you do is you take your cell phone and you take a picture of your quilt. And then what helps is if you change that picture to black and white or grayscale. When you do that, then you can see your quilt in a different way. I know that in some quilt shops they have red tinted glasses. And when you look through those red tinted glasses, then you can see different tones of your fabric, and if they it helps you see that in a different way. But I find that when you put the black and white or the grayscale, it makes a really big difference, and you can see how balanced it is if you want. Something like this quilt, you don't have to worry about it. But in the future, when you have more scrappy kind of quilt tops you're putting together, that's a really helpful tool. All right, so now that I have my layout how I want it, and now I have my tape the way it is, I'm just going to continue to tear off my pieces. I'm going to pin them on, and then I'm going to put them together. Now, say for example, if I'm doing this right now where I literally am just holding all of them, then I don't have to necessarily worry about pinning it so much. I'm not having any movement, and especially, and that's the next thing I'm going to do for the next hour, is I'm just going to put this together. You don't need to worry so much about that. I have seen some pins where they actually have the numbers on the heads of the pins, and so those would be handy as well. So now what we're going to do, now that these are all, you know where they're going to go, the next step, so I'm just going to pin this first row because I want to show you the next step of your quilting process. I'm really interested to hear how the process is going for you, so please let's share how things are going. I'd love to hear your progress or any questions or concerns. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take block 1.1 beside 1.2. And then we are going to place the right sides together, and we're going to line up these two edges. And then once those are lined up, I'm going to bring this over to my machine, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. You're going to then join 1.2 to 1.3, and then so what I would do now is I would then, I'm just going to have my strip sets, or not my strip set, I'm going to put my blocks together. So I'm going to put 1.3 beside 1.4. I'm going to pin that, and then I'm going to do the same thing here, and I'm going to put the 1.5, and then I'm going to join those two together. So when I come to my sewing machine, I'm just going to be able to zip all these up together, and I'll have my one row. So once my first row is sewn, I'm going to use my guide on the pattern to know which direction I want to press my seams. So on row 1, I'm going to press my seams to the left. And then on row 2, I'm going to press my seams to the right. And of course, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to lock those seams when I'm doing my quilting. So that will work really well for me. And then I continue to do that. So we're going to sew all our rows together, 1 through 5. We're going to press them in the order that they've asked us. And then once those are pressed in that way, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the 9 patch. And we're going to put the right sides together. We're going to make sure that our seams are going to be locking. We want to have that look really nice and crisp. And then we're going to have that whole top together. Once the whole top is together, then we can press the entire quilt, and we're just going to press the seams facing down. throughout on all 4 of our rows. And then our quilt top will be ready to be quilted. And so that will be the quilting and basting of that. So as you can see, the process is getting much quicker. In fact, I was able to put this quilt top together in a really short time. And so one of the reasons that I have made it like this is because we want to be able to have projects that are going to go together really quickly. We all have big hearts and we all want to do good things, but we also only have a limited amount of time every day. And so to make a quick project like this, it's really satisfying. And these principles that we're practicing will just keep help building our skills. So I just encourage you to continue to practice building your skills, to use up your stash, and to be able to think about now who you want to be giving this quilt to. Is this a family member who's gone through something? Is it a local charity, Ronald McDonald House, Project Linus? There's a lot of different places out there that are collecting quilts. Oh, pardon me. So continue sewing our rows together. So I went ahead and sewed we have 5 rows. And so I sew the first and second row together. I sew the 4th and 5th row together. And I leave the 3rd row separate. And the reason I do this is so that when I go to press this, I don't have them all at once. And so what I've done now is, so here's the 1st and 2nd row, and they are attached to the 3rd, and then the 4th and 5th are then attached to the 3rd. So they all join to the middle. And what that does is it just keeps everything organized. Now, one of the things that you might notice when you are sewing your rows together is that you have a problem with joining the seams. And that's why it's really important that we use our ruler to square up all the blocks before we put them together. So for this particular block, they're 8 inches. So each one is going to be 8 inches when you put it together. So that's really important to keep in mind. One of the tips that I show you in the video here, as you can see, is that we want the seams on the one row to go right and the other one to go left, so then they lock seams. I've talked about that a lot. But that really does help you have a lot of precision when you're piecing. The other thing that can happen is this. So I've sewed the seam and my stitch wasn't quite tight enough or small enough. So when I'm, holding the quilt and maneuvering it, those seams are going to unravel. So when you make garments, you always backstitch when you're doing a seam. When we do quilting, we don't do that. We actually we shorten our stitch length, and then we are just more careful when we're maneuvering the quilt, so touching it or manipulating it, I should say. So if that happens, you just go back, you then sew, you adjust your seam stitch length, and then you sew it. Okay, so what we're going to do next is I'm going to sew rows 2 and 3 that are paired, and I've pressed them. And I also sewed row 4 and 5 together, and I pressed them. If you want to sew row 1 and 2 together, 3 and 4 together, and then add your 5, that's totally fine. I just find that it's helpful to do it this way. So when I'm sewing, I'm going to just make sure that my project is going to stay on the desk. I don't really want my project to be sliding off or anything, because when that happens, it kind of jerks, or it just doesn't have a nice flow. So the other thing that I like to do is use pins to anchor. So I like to anchor my seam intersection here, making sure that the one seam is going to the right and the other one's going to the left. And so if you need a stitch leader, you can. My machine is pretty good about not falling with the feed dogs there, or getting jumbled up in the feed dogs. And so when you're doing this, it's a good idea to keep an eye on the seams, making sure that you're going to catch them. Because when you are quilting, you're going to be intersecting a lot of these seams, right? And so that's why you don't backstitch. The other reason you don't backstitch is when you backstitch, especially if you have a heavier weight thread, you're going to create a bulk of that thread, and so that's going to cause some troubles there. These clover pins are delightful. They're nice and thin. They are quilting pins, so they work really well for your piecing. And we're just going to go at the rate that you are comfortable with. Some machines have a little rabbit or a turtle. They have a speed guide, so that can also help you. And you go at the pace that you want. This is not a race, so just keep going. Just keeping it nice and flat. Everything we're working on is nice and flat. Just stitch off a few extra off of there, because what's happening is those threads will kind of twist, and that allows that to happen. So then, now that we finished that seam, we're going to do the same thing on joining our 3 and 4. Now, one suggestion before you start stitching is, especially with this fabric, because it's a directional fabric, make sure that you've got it all in the right direction. I have unpicked many times because I was not as careful about my directional prints. Not every print is directional, but for this one, for example, is directional. So we want to make sure that it's going to be all looking the right way. I have a friend that says there's no mistakes in quilting, just creative variations. So if you want to have a creative variation and have it flipped the other way and not worry so much about directionality, that's totally your choice. I think for me it would probably really bother me. Well, actually I know for me it would bother me if it wasn't all the right direction. But it's your quilt, and so you can decide about that. We are done with week 4. So exciting. You have your quilt top all pieced and ready to go. Next week we are going to be basting our quilt, and then we're going to do my very favorite part, the free motion quilting. Thanks for joining us. See you next week. Happy quilting.